I'm now joined by Tom Lee, co-founder of Fundstrat Global Advisors, who, of course, is one of Wall Street's top independent research providers. And Tom himself really needs no introduction. We're talking about one of the most widely followed macro strategists out there. He's been providing research on the equity markets for some 30 years now. He's also a regular CNBC contributor. But Tom decided to bring his experience and expertise to the ETF space, into the ETF Terror Dome. And so Fundstrat Capital, which is an affiliate of Fundstrat Global Advisors, they are behind one of the fastest growing ETFs, the Fundstrat Granny Shots US Large Cap ETF, ticker GRNY. Tom is, of course, the portfolio manager on that, and he's now joining me from New York. Tom, it is a pleasure. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so I want to start by giving you a stat, which you may or may not be familiar with, but I thought you might like hearing this either way, which is since your ETF launched last November, there have been over 700 ETFs that have come to market, over 700 new ETF launches. Out of those, your ETF is number 5 in inflows with over $1.9 billion. And of course, if you add in the performance of Granny, which has been excellent, and we can talk about that if you'd like, you're now past $2 billion in assets in about 9 months. And so to start, I'd love to hear why you think this ETF has resonated with investors so quickly.
Hi, Nate. Yes. Well, foremost, thank you for having me on. It's great to have this conversation. And I think that Granny Shots ETF resonates with folks for a couple of reasons. One is I do think it was just very familiar, because Granny Shots was originally a research portfolio of Fundstrat. So in 2019, we launched Granny Shots, which was this idea that the biggest driver of the stock market are really themes, like in the 80s, it was this boomer entering the workforce, and it was a retail stocks did best, the retailers. And then in the 90s, of course, it was the internet boom. And that was something Gen X's understood. And that was all about the build of the infrastructure and the services that came out of the internet. So Granny Shots, in 2019, we launched it saying, look, there are 3 or 4 key story arcs to the stock market over the next 10 years that we want investors to understand, but then we want to pick stocks that are linked to at least 2 of those themes, because then you're not putting all your chips into like AI or cybersecurity. We're saying a stock that straddles both worlds is probably a better play. So I think that familiarity helped. And I think the second thing that really helped Granny stand out was that I do think the market is looking for what we consider to be a sort of a thematic approach to investing. We're simplifying because we're saying we don't want to just chase Palantir, and Palantir is a Granny Shot. But we want you to understand that Palantir is not just about AI, but it's providing essential security, but it also happens to be tied to easing financial conditions. So it's like people understand what we're doing. And maybe the third thing that helps is we do publish a weekly video on our website, and it provides a lot of transparency, because I think it gets anywhere from 30 to 50,000 people to watch it every week. And it explains what's happening to Granny Shots. So I think people feel like we're being very transparent about the approach.
Okay, so several things I want to follow up on there with what you just said. First, going back to the research, obviously, again, you've been effectively running this strategy for a long time. What made you decide to bring this into the ETF arena? Why bring this into an ETF wrapper?
Yes, there were several reasons. Fundstrat has a large community of subscribers and family users. It's about 400 hedge funds and 10,000 RIAs and family offices. So it's a large community. And many folks really liked the simplicity of the Granny Shots, how we explain it. And it doesn't trade a lot. We only rebalance every 3 months, and we still do. But they found that the rebalances themselves was a bulky process, because that involved them, it's 35 stock portfolio roughly, and they have to buy and sell. So in a way, we thought it would simplify the process for them, and it's tax efficient by creating an ETF, because now instead of them personally doing the rebalances through our research-driven process, we're essentially making that a little easier. And again, at the core, Granny Shots is a research-first stock portfolio. It's not no gunslinger here, no one making factor bets. It's literally evidence-based research on the key themes, and we're buying the strong stocks.
By the way, do you want to explain the name of this ETF, the Granny Shots ETF? That's certainly a unique name in the fund world in general, not just in ETFs.
Well, the original research portfolio was called Granny Shots, and it's a tribute to Rick Barry. Granny Shots refers to an unconventional way to do a free throw, which is underhanded. Most free throws, well, actually, in the history of basketball, the original free throw was a granny shot because it's the correct physics way to shoot. Fewest moving parts of your body, and therefore you have the highest chance of success. Rick Barry popularized this. He was an NBA Hall of Famer, made 90% of his free throws using a granny shots. An overhand free throw shot has less than a 50% chance of success rate. Rick Barry was a 90% hit with his free throws.
I love that. I should have used that methodology back when I played basketball. I always shot overhand, which I was pretty good at it, but I probably could have been a little bit better. In terms of the strategy underpinning this ETF, you walk through it at a high level. You mentioned Palantir. Can you give maybe another example or two of key themes right now, and then perhaps tie that down to the individual stock level as well? Like basically explain how you're expressing these themes through individual names.
Well, we spend every year, the start of the year, thinking about, are the themes that we have in place still things that will be 5 to 10 year stories? Because we start with this idea that we're not trying to find the stock that works the next week or the next day, but really the arbitrage you have in the stock market is time. So we want to find the most powerful things that last 5 to 10 years. And so at the moment, the fundamental themes are things like what we call global labor shortage. Believe it or not, since 2018, and we wrote a white paper on this, the world has had a shortage of prime age workers. Now, we studied that since 1930. Whenever there's been episodic shortage of human prime age workforce relative to population, it's always resulted in a technology boom. It happened in 1958 to 67, 1991 to 99. The third one started in 2018, and it's not set to be in balance again until 2035. So this is the largest period in history of structural labor shortage. And that's why we have an AI boom. A second theme, and I won't walk through all 7, but a second theme that we've talked about is originally was the idea of energy security, that we thought the world was going to have a shortage of actual access to sustainable power. Now, again, we wrote about this in 2019, and lo and behold, it's become more acute today. There's huge shortages of power plant capacity everywhere, especially because of data center growth and now electrification and clean energy pursuits. We've added cybersecurity to this as well, because the idea that AI and tools and technology have made it harder for protecting companies' proprietary secrets, but individuals as well. And if you ask us how that's evolving, our team's been thinking about this, and we realized that energy security and cybersecurity are probably parts of the story of sovereign security. And so I think that that's one way our granny shots will evolve in the next 3 to 5 years, is to incorporate, as long as we can model it properly and identify the correct stocks. But I think sovereign security is now one of the key differences. But that's an example of our sort of way we derive themes. And then a stock, we create separate stock lists for each theme. We have to put a lot of paper, go to the library. It's not like you Google it. We find the companies that are most central to those themes. Now, again, it could be because they're playing a role in policy. It could be because they're big spenders. It's not always that straightforward. But the existence of them on a single theme does not make them a granny shot. They have to be tied two separate story arcs, because we believe that's how you get a higher probability of the stock working. And I'll give you an example. During the internet boom of the 90s, the top internet stocks gained 1,700%. So $1,000 turned into 1.7 million. But if you bought a basket of every internet stock in 1999, you only had to be finding 8% of the winners. Your success rate only had to be 8%, and you outperformed the S&P. But imagine if you took 5 themes and you only had an 8% success rate. Then you have a 40% success rate of picking a monster stock. That's what we're doing with Granny Shots. We're saying, if you buy AI and you make a basket of AIs, maybe you'll be 10% of those will be winners. But imagine if you do cumulative probability. You buy 5 themes, but the stock is tied to each theme. Your cumulative probability actually is the sum of the 8%, not 8% times 8%. So, and I think it's showing up in the results, because Granny Shots year to date is up 18%. And it's outperforming the Momentum Index, MTUM ETF, and S&P is up 7.4%. So we're already adding 10 percentage points to your return, or 1,000 basis points, by this approach that by adding themes together, and a stock is in multiple themes, you're getting a higher cumulative probability of a successful stock.
As you walk through that framework there, one question that I have is there any particular reason why you're sticking with large cap stocks? Because it seems like you could make the case that some of the themes that you're identifying, if you're correct, there are smaller cap names that could stand to benefit as well. So why stick to large caps?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. So maybe at the start, Granny Shots is kind of proving that the market is not Mag 7, because we're only buying large cap stocks and we're beating Mag 7. So like when you hear someone say the S&P is concentrated only 7 stocks, Granny is proof that that is a false argument. That really is people who decide to be structurally bearish and not realize there's plenty of great stocks out there. Because, Granny owns JP Morgan, American Express, Axon, it owns Caterpillar. They're not Mag 7 stocks. So that's why we started with large cap. But to your point, Nate, we also at Fundstrat have run the SMID Granny Shots research portfolio, which is SMID cap. So it's non-Russell 1000. That's actually also massively outperforming the broad indices. And we are getting the same questions. Well, people now want us, they're like, Tom, we're tired of rebalancing your SMID Grannies every quarter. Would you consider doing this as an investment product? And so I think that you're asking exactly the right question. One of the things for Granny that we're watching is, we're not on any major investment platform yet, because we haven't crossed the 1-year anniversary. So we have no previous investment product. So we've been having to grow Granny Shots and Fundstrat Capital with basically our arms tied, because we're not on Morgan Stanley or Bank of America. In fact, a lot of people say they try to buy Granny through their Merrill Direct and they can't purchase it. So we're literally restricted on most platforms. So once we hit the 1 year is when the investment platforms could consider adding us. And then I think it makes sense for us to expand our menu of offerings, because we know people can access. But we've been dealing with a lot of frustration. People are like, well, Tom, on my, Merrill Direct or whatever, I want to buy Granny for my IRA, but we're not even allowed to. So I don't want to extra frustrate people by introducing SMID Granny, and they can't buy that either. So, hopefully we get everything lined up, but I know those things take time. So we just have to be patient.
In terms of growing Granny and finding that audience, you were alluding to this earlier, some of the education that you do. I actually talked about this in my previous segment. Look, Tom, you obviously do a lot of media. I mentioned that you're a CNBC contributor. You do a lot of other stuff as well. And so I think clearly you do a nice job of getting the word out on how you're viewing financial markets. But to your point earlier, you also do a weekly video. where you're basically communicating your investment thought process at any given point in time, and you're explaining your security selection. I know you do monthly webinars and those sorts of things. Why is that so important to you? Because I'll tell you, not every issuer does that.
Yeah, it is a lot of work. So we're doing it not because we think it's easy for us, but we think it's very important. Fundstrat's core mantra is really we're trying to help investors understand what's happening in the stock market so that they can make better decisions. We started our business 11 years ago focusing on institutional investors. And I think we've changed a lot of the ways institutions invest. But now we're trying to demonstrate a process to a broader audience because, as you know, people often have to fight their own instincts because the market can be confusing. They see a headline and they want to sell, and we preach this idea that unless it's going to change your thesis, you shouldn't do anything. And it really came into play during the tariff Armageddon that happened in April. People were obviously very concerned because the world had its like Cuban Missile Crisis moment. And we thought it was extremely important, especially in our videos. GRNY, we covered a lot of the macro saying, look, markets, when they have a waterfall decline, and if you don't have a recession, it's always a V-shaped recovery, that we said we would recover all the losses from February to April before the end of the summer. And then someone would say, well, why would you have a recession? Because that would come up in the comments of the video. And then the next week we explained that the high yield market was barely reacting to tariff Armageddon. So it's hugely improbable that the US was actually barreling into a recession. So now, GRNY was under a lot of pressure, but we thought it was important to help people anchor what we were saying on the macro side, Fundstrat research to how the GRNY holder should react. And then we've had a lot of folks thank us because they realized that we had that V-shaped rebound and we kept them sane through the process because we explained to them why history showed it would be a V-shaped recovery. And of course, it was a very difficult time for us and everybody because no one likes to see the market fall 20% literally in like a month. But we also knew that was going to be a symmetric recovery. And while people were angry at us, now that we look back, that's exactly what happened.
I want to very briefly ask you about Ethereum, but before I do that, just to close the conversation on GRNY, and obviously, Tom, there are a lot of different types of investors with different goals. We're not here to offer any sort of investment advice, but I'm assuming you view GRNY as something that could occupy the core of a portfolio. Is that correct?
Yes. In fact, that's why GRNY shots makes sense as a word, because like whenever I write research or I'm on CBC, I always think of my late father. And actually, I want to make sure whatever I explain is understandable to him. My dad was a doctor his entire life. He never understood investing. But I figured whatever I say, I need to make sure he understands. So the idea that we want whatever we do to be clear enough that someone who's worried about their grandmother's portfolio could feel confident we're managing and we're explaining what we're doing. Because if you don't understand what we're doing, then you can't trust us. And so that's why GRNY Shots also is an appropriate name.
I love that. That's perfect. Your grandmother has to understand GRNY's approach. That's perfect.